They laughed at the black security lady until she fired the CEO during the board meeting. Miss Joyce was the quiet, unnoticed security lady they all ridiculed, until the day she walked into the boardroom with a secret that would bring the mighty CEO to his knees. They had no idea that the woman they laughed at was about to change everything and take control of the company they thought was theirs. It was just another day at the towering glass building where Miss Joyce worked. The company, StarTech Industries, had thousands of employees buzzing in and out, too busy to notice a quiet, humble face like hers. She wore her usual dark blue security uniform, always neat and pressed, her small name tag pinned proudly on her chest. Her job was to guard the entrance, checking IDs and greeting people as they came and went. No one really paid her much attention except when they had to, and even then, most didn't even know her name. Miss Joyce was used to being invisible. After all, she had been working at StarTech for 5 long years. She had a warm smile, and her soft eyes always seemed to carry a quiet kindness. But there was something else, something much deeper behind those eyes, that nobody ever noticed. They saw her as just the security lady, nothing more. When the CEO, Mr. Richards, and the board members walked past her, they never greeted her with respect. In fact, they barely looked at her at all, except to make a joke at her expense. They chuckled at the way she dressed, at her old-fashioned hairstyle, and even at her posture as she stood at her post, perfectly still. Mr. Richards, with his sharp suit and a grin that always seemed a bit too wide, loved to make snide remarks about the help. "Here she is, the queen of security," he'd say, loud enough for everyone around to hear, causing the board members to burst into laughter. "Maybe one day, she'll be guarding the gates of heaven, huh?" Everyone laughed, except Miss Joyce. She kept her head down, her face calm, never once reacting to their cruel jokes. She simply smiled, nodded, and continued with her job. But deep down, there was something simmering, a strength no one saw. On this particular day, there was an important board meeting on the top floor. Mr. Richards was pacing the room, full of his usual arrogance, ready to unveil his grand plans for the company. The board members were seated around a long, polished table, some sipping water, others checking their phones, waiting for the meeting to start. "Miss Joyce," Mr. Richards called out from the glass-walled room, his voice loud and impatient. "We're dying of thirst in here. Would you mind bringing us some coffee? And make it quick, please." The laughter that followed was sharp, like knives being thrown into the air. Miss Joyce walked over to the conference room without a word, her footsteps quiet and steady. As she pushed open the door, the chatter grew louder. They were talking about her again, like they always did. But this time, the mockery felt different, harsher. "She's been here longer than half the board members, and yet here she is, still handing out coffee." One of the board members sneered. "You'd think she'd have found herself a better job by now." "I bet she enjoys it," another chimed in, smirking. The power of being the boss of the front desk. The room filled with laughter again, everyone shaking their heads and grinning at Miss Joyce as she quietly placed the coffee mugs in front of each person. She never flinched, never gave them the satisfaction of seeing her upset. She moved gracefully, pouring the coffee with calm precision, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. But if anyone had looked closely, just for a moment, they might have noticed a small, almost imperceptible twinkle in her eyes. It was like a light that flickered briefly, a hidden spark beneath her calm, quiet surface. But no one saw it. They were too busy laughing. "Thank you, Miss Joyce. We really couldn't survive without you," Mr. Richards said mockingly as she finished serving the last cup. He leaned back in his chair, smirking as if he had just delivered the funniest line of the day. The others chuckled, nodding along, as though she were nothing more than a shadow in the room. Miss Joyce simply nodded again, her expression calm, serene even. But something was different about her today. She was thinking about something important, something no one in that room could possibly understand. Her hands, steady and sure, told a different story than the one Mr. Richards and the others imagined. The meeting began, and Miss Joyce quietly stepped out, back to her station by the entrance. She stood there, as always, hands folded neatly in front of her. But this time, something was different. Inside, she was planning, thinking about what was to come. Mr. Richards might have been laughing now, but he wouldn't be laughing for long. There was a secret she carried, one that she had kept hidden for years. It was a secret that would soon change everything, though the room full of powerful people upstairs had no idea. To them, she was just the security lady. To her, they were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. Miss Joyce stood at her post, her eyes scanning the room, but her mind was elsewhere. She was waiting for the right moment, the moment when everything would fall into place. The laughter from the board meeting still echoed in her ears, but it didn't bother her. Not anymore. Because soon, the tables would turn, and the people who had laughed at her would be left speechless. The sound of laughter from the boardroom had long faded, but it echoed in Miss Joyce's mind as she stood at her post, her face calm and unreadable. To anyone passing by, she was just a quiet woman doing her job, standing by the door, watching the world rush past her. But what they didn't know was that behind her gentle smile and humble uniform was a woman who had once stood at the top of her field. Many years ago, Joyce had been known not as Miss Joyce, the security lady, but as Joyce Harrison, a successful businesswoman with a powerful presence in the world of corporate finance. She had worked tirelessly to build her career, earning respect and admiration along the way. Her sharp mind and strategic thinking had caught the attention of investors, and soon she was known for her ability to turn failing companies into thriving enterprises. But life, as it often does, took an unexpected turn. Joyce lost her husband suddenly in a car accident, leaving her to care for their young daughter alone. The grief was too much, the demands of her career too heavy. She made the difficult choice to step away from her high-powered position to focus on her family. As the years passed, she found solace in a quieter life, though it was not without its struggles. She took a job as a security officer, hoping for stability and peace, something that would give her time to heal while supporting her daughter. What no one at StarTech knew was that when Joyce had left the corporate world, she hadn't left everything behind. Years before, she had made an investment in StarTech, buying up shares when the company was still small and relatively unknown. It had been a smart move at the time, one that no one could have predicted would pay off as much as it did. Over the years, Joyce had quietly accumulated significant shares, enough to give her a powerful voice within the company. She had kept this part of her life hidden, not wanting the attention or pressure that would come with it. But now, as she watched Mr. Richards and the board destroy the company she had once believed in, she knew something had to change. Standing at her post, Joyce couldn't help but think about how far StarTech had fallen under Mr. Richards' leadership. She had watched silently as bad decisions were made, as employees were laid off, and as the company's reputation crumbled. Richards was only interested in lining his own pockets, ignoring the long-term health of the business. Joyce had known all along that she could step in, use her shares to challenge him, but she had been hesitant. She had built a quiet life for herself, and disrupting it by returning to the corporate battleground was something she had avoided for a long time. But things were different now. Her daughter, now in college, was struggling to afford tuition, and Joyce's modest salary as a security officer wasn't enough to cover the costs. Her family was hurting, and she could no longer afford to stay silent. The company she had once cared about was being driven into the ground, and the people who worked there, people just like her, were paying the price. Miss Joyce's hands tightened slightly as she stood by the entrance, her mind racing. The time had come to act. She began making plans. Quietly, carefully, without drawing attention to herself, she started attending shareholder meetings, blending into the background. No one ever looked twice at her. They didn't recognize her as a shareholder, and certainly not as someone who had the power to influence the company's future. After all, to them, she was just the security lady. But Joyce was always watching, listening, absorbing everything that was said. She took note of every poor decision, every moment of greed from Mr. Richards and his cronies. They continued to mock her, blind to the power she held. The more they laughed, the more determined she became. At night, when the building was quiet and the halls empty, Joyce would return home and spread out her notes on the kitchen table. She reviewed financial reports, looked at the company's stock performance, and studied the market trends. She knew exactly where Mr. Richards had gone wrong, and she had the knowledge and the power to fix it. But it wasn't just about saving the company anymore. It was personal. Joyce thought about her daughter, about the future she wanted to give her, and about the people who worked at StarTech who were just trying to make a living. She thought about the arrogance of Mr. Richards and the board, and how they thought they were untouchable. They had no idea that the very person they mocked held the key to their future. But there was also a part of Joyce that hesitated. Could she really step back into that world after all these years? Could she give up her quiet, simple life for the chaos that was sure to follow if she made her move? She wasn't sure. There were moments when the weight of it all felt too heavy, when she thought about walking away, letting someone else fight this battle. But then she remembered the laughter, the way they looked at her like she was nothing. And in those moments, the decision became clear. Miss Joyce knew what she had to do. She had the power, and now it was time to use it. The next board meeting was coming up, and this time, she wouldn't just be the security lady standing by the door. She would be walking into that room as a shareholder, a force to be reckoned with. The days of silent watching were over. It was a quiet afternoon when Miss Joyce received the letter that would change everything. She was at her usual post, standing by the main entrance of the StarTech building, her eyes scanning the lobby as employees rushed in and out, too busy to notice her. She didn't expect anything unusual to happen that day. But then, a young man in a crisp suit approached her, holding a white envelope with her name on it. "Miss Joyce Harrison?" he asked, a bit uncertain, as if he didn't quite believe that the name on the letter belonged to the quiet security lady standing in front of him. "Yes, that's me," Joyce said, taking the envelope from his hand. She gave him a polite nod, and he hurried off without another word. Joyce's fingers lingered on the envelope for a moment before she opened it. Inside was a formal letter from the company's legal team. Her eyes scanned the words quickly, her heartbeat picking up speed as she read. It was an invitation to attend the next board meeting, not as an employee, but as a shareholder. For a moment, Joyce stood perfectly still, the letter clutched in her hand. She had expected this moment to come eventually, but now that it was here, she felt a surge of emotion she hadn't anticipated. After all these years of quietly observing, of letting them believe she was just the security lady, the time had come. They had no idea who she really was, no idea of the power she held. And now, they had unknowingly invited her into the very room where they made decisions that affected thousands of lives. A small smile tugged at the corners of her mouth, but she quickly composed herself. No one could know what she was planning. Not yet. The board members, including Mr. Richards, had no clue about the true nature of the invitation. To them, it seemed like a mistake, a clerical error. When the legal team sent the notice that Miss Joyce was expected to attend the next meeting as a shareholder, they all assumed it was a joke. Can you believe it? One board member chuckled over a drink after work. They invited the security lady to the board meeting. The legal team really dropped the ball this time. Mr. Richards, ever arrogant, leaned back in his chair, swirling his drink with a smirk on his face. It's probably some mix-up with the names. There's no way she's a shareholder. I'll deal with it at the meeting. We've got bigger things to worry about. And indeed, there were pressing issues at hand. The company was facing a financial crisis, and Mr. Richards had planned to announce sweeping layoffs during the upcoming meeting. His decisions would affect hundreds of employees, but he didn't seem too concerned. To him, it was all about the bottom line. By this time next week, we'll have cut costs, boosted our stock price, and I'll look like a hero to the shareholders, Richards said confidently, tapping his fingers on the table. None of them suspected that one of the very shareholders they were trying to impress had been right under their noses all along. Meanwhile, Miss Joyce prepared for the meeting in her own quiet way. She didn't need flashy suits or fancy presentations to make her point. She had something much more powerful: knowledge, experience, and the truth. At home, she spent the evenings reviewing documents, going over every detail of the company's financial situation. She had always been meticulous, and now was no different. She read the board minutes, the quarterly reports, and the company's stock performance. It was worse than she had thought. Mr. Richards had been making reckless decisions for months, decisions that were driving the company into the ground. The layoffs he planned were just another desperate move to cover up his failures. Miss Joyce knew that the upcoming meeting would be critical, not just for the company, but for the hundreds of employees who would lose their jobs if Mr. Richards had his way. And she couldn't let that happen. The night before the meeting, Joyce laid out her old business suit. It had been years since she'd worn it, but it still fit perfectly. As she looked at herself in the mirror, she hardly recognized the woman staring back. The quiet, unassuming security lady was gone. In her place stood the confident businesswoman she had once been, and would be again. The day of the meeting arrived, and Mr. Richards was in high spirits. He walked into the boardroom with his usual swagger, nodding to the other members of the board as they took their seats. The room was filled with chatter, but none of them took notice of Miss Joyce when she quietly walked in and sat at the far end of the table. Mr. Richards glanced her way, smirking slightly, but didn't say anything. He assumed the legal team would straighten out the mistakes soon enough. The meeting began, and Mr. Richards launched into his presentation, explaining his grand plans to save the company. He spoke confidently about the layoffs, painting them as necessary and inevitable. The board members nodded along, though some looked uneasy. Miss Joyce sat quietly at the far end of the table, her security uniform a stark contrast to the expensive suits worn by the board members. She was barely acknowledged, as always assumed to be sitting there by mistake. Some board members glanced at her curiously, wondering what she was doing in the room. Others simply ignored her, focused on Mr. Richards' presentation. The CEO didn't even look her way, confident that whatever mix-up had brought her here would soon be resolved. He was too busy talking about his grand vision for the company. "The layoffs are tough, sure," Mr. Richards said, pacing around the room with his usual self-assured smirk. "But it's necessary. It's for the greater good. The stock price will rebound, and everyone, shareholders especially, will be grateful." Some of the board members nodded in agreement. Others remained quiet, unsure but unwilling to challenge the CEO openly. After all, Mr. Richards had always led with a sense of invincibility, the kind that made people hesitant to question his authority. Miss Joyce listened carefully, her face expressionless. But inside, the tension built with every word he spoke. She had watched him destroy everything that once made StarTech a place where people were proud to work. And now he was about to seal the fate of hundreds of employees, all in the name of profit. When the time came for a vote on the layoffs, the atmosphere in the room shifted slightly. A few board members whispered among themselves, looking at the agenda in front of them. Mr. Richards, sensing some hesitation, leaned forward, eyes gleaming with confidence. "Now, I know some of you might feel uneasy about this," he said, his tone smooth and persuasive. "But this is the right move. The only move. I've led this company through rough times before, and I'll do it again. You can trust me." He flashed a confident smile around the room, his gaze sweeping over everyone, except Miss Joyce. He had yet to realize that the woman he had mocked for years was about to change everything. As the board prepared to vote, Miss Joyce stood up. The room fell silent instantly. Mr. Richards finally looked her way, his smile faltering for the first time. The board members exchanged confused glances, unsure of what was happening. "I have a few things to say before we cast this vote," Joyce said, her voice steady and calm. She held their attention without raising her voice, and the silence in the room grew thick with tension. Mr. Richards raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "This is a private board matter, Miss Joyce," he said, a hint of condescension in his tone. "I'm not sure why you're—" But before he could finish, Miss Joyce interrupted, her eyes locked onto his. "I'm here as a shareholder," she said, letting the words hang in the air for a moment. "A major shareholder." The shock that rippled through the room was instant. A few board members gasped softly, while others stared at her, wide-eyed. The confusion was palpable. How could the security lady be a shareholder, let alone a major one? Whispers spread around the table like wildfire. Mr. Richards' face, once smug and full of confidence, slowly began to shift. His eyes narrowed, and his smile disappeared entirely. He looked at her as though trying to piece together something that didn't make sense. "Shareholder," he repeated, almost incredulously. "What are you talking about?" Miss Joyce reached into her bag and pulled out a small folder, calmly placing it on the table in front of her. She opened it, revealing official documents that confirmed her significant ownership of StarTech stock. "I've been a shareholder for years," she continued, her voice measured but firm. "I've quietly watched this company rise, and now I'm watching it fall. And I'm watching you, Mr. Richards, drive it into the ground." The board members leaned forward in their seats, the tension now so thick it was almost unbearable. Mr. Richards' face turned pale as he glanced at the documents, realizing that this wasn't a joke or some kind of mistake. Miss Joyce, the security lady, had real power here. "I've done my research," Joyce said, her gaze never wavering from Mr. Richards. "Your decisions over the past few years have hurt this company more than you'll ever admit. These layoffs, they're not for the good of the company. They are for your own benefit, to cover up the mess you've created." Mr. Richards' jaw clenched as he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The board members were no longer looking at him. They were staring at Miss Joyce, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and awe. "You're cutting jobs, ruining lives, and for what?" Miss Joyce continued, her voice rising just slightly, the calm breaking for a moment. "To pad the numbers, to make it look like you're saving the company. But all you're doing is destroying what's left of it." The room was silent. The air was heavy with the weight of her words. For the first time, Mr. Richards looked uncertain. His once steady voice cracked as he tried to respond. This isn't what it looks like," he stammered, glancing nervously at the other board members, searching for support. But they remained silent, watching him unravel. Miss Joyce took a step forward, her presence now commanding the room. "I won't let you ruin this company," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "You may have been in charge all these years, but today, I'm using my voice. And I know I'm not the only one in this room who sees the truth." Mr. Richards opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His once invincible facade had crumbled, and the power in the room had shifted. The board members, still stunned, began to realize that the vote they were about to cast wasn't as simple as they had thought. The security lady they had dismissed for so long had just become the most powerful person in the room. The silence in the boardroom was deafening. Every pair of eyes was glued to Miss Joyce as she stood at the end of the table, her calm gaze locked on Mr. Richards. The once boisterous CEO now sat stiffly in his chair, his face pale, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. The confident smirk that had once been a permanent fixture on his face had vanished, replaced by uncertainty and fear. Joyce's revelation as a major shareholder had already sent shockwaves through the room, but what she was about to say next would leave no doubt about who was truly in charge now. "I've reviewed the company's financials in depth," Miss Joyce began, her voice steady, but filled with quiet authority. "I've watched as bad decisions have been made, as trust has been broken with employees and shareholders alike. And I believe it's time for new leadership. Leadership that actually cares about the future of this company and the people who work here." Her words hung in the air like a storm cloud, ready to burst. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some glancing at Mr. Richards, others staring at Miss Joyce with a mixture of surprise and newfound respect. "I am putting forth a motion," Joyce continued, her tone resolute, "to remove Mr. Richards as CEO of StarTech Industries, effective immediately." A stunned gasp echoed through the room. Mr. Richards sat bolt upright in his chair, his face flushing red with rage. "You can't be serious," he spat, his voice trembling with fury. "This is my company. I've led it for years. You have no idea what you're talking about." But Joyce didn't flinch. She remained calm, unshaken by his outburst. "I know exactly what I'm talking about," she said, her voice like steel. "You've been leading this company into the ground, and it's time for someone else to step up and fix the damage you've done." Richards slammed his fist on the table, his composure unraveling before everyone's eyes. "You have no right to do this," he shouted, looking around the room for support, but the board members were no longer on his side. They had seen his leadership falter and crumble in the face of Joyce's calm, methodical analysis. Joyce gave a small nod to the legal team sitting in the corner. "As a major shareholder, I have every right," she said quietly. Mr. Richards' eyes darted around the room, searching for allies. But instead of finding support, he saw doubt, hesitation, and the realization that maybe, just maybe, Joyce was right. The board members whispered among themselves, exchanging uneasy glances. Some had questioned Richards' leadership in private, but no one had dared to challenge him outright. Until now. "Let's put it to a vote," Joyce said, turning to the board. "Those in favor of removing Mr. Richards as CEO, raise your hands." For a moment, no one moved. The tension in the room was unbearable. Mr. Richards sat frozen in his chair, his fists clenched, his face twisted in disbelief. He had never imagined this moment would come. He had never imagined that she, the woman he had belittled and mocked for years, would be the one to bring him down. Slowly, one hand went up, then another, and another. Mr. Richards' eyes widened as he watched the hands rise around the table. His face turned ashen, and his lips parted in shock. The vote was unanimous. "No, this can't be happening," he muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. But it was happening. It was over. Joyce nodded calmly as the last hand was raised, her expression serene. "The vote is clear," she said, her voice steady. "Mr. Richards, you are no longer the CEO of StarTech Industries." Richards shot up from his seat, his face a mask of fury. "You'll regret this," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I've built this company. You can't just throw me out like this." But the power in the room had shifted. The board members, once loyal to Richards, now sat in stunned silence, fully aware that the decision had been made. Joyce remained calm, her hands resting on the table in front of her. "This isn't about revenge," she said softly. "It's about doing what's right for the company and its people. Your time here is over." Mr. Richards stood there, trembling with anger. But he knew it was futile to argue any further. He stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The room was silent once again, but this time the silence was filled with a sense of finality. The once mighty CEO was gone, and in his place stood a new leader, one who had been hiding in plain sight all along. Joyce turned to face the board, her calm demeanor never wavering. "I want to make it clear," she said, addressing the room, "that my priority is the future of this company and the people who work here. We will find a way to recover from these mistakes, but we will do it with integrity, and we will do it together." There was a pause, and then one of the senior board members spoke up, his voice quiet but filled with respect. "Thank you, Miss Joyce," he said, "for reminding us what true leadership looks like." Joyce gave a small, grateful nod. She didn't need applause or recognition. She had simply done what was necessary. As the meeting ended and the board members began to file out of the room, no one dared to laugh at the security lady anymore. They looked at her with a new sense of respect, respect that she had earned, not through power or wealth, but through quiet strength and undeniable wisdom. Miss Joyce gathered her things, walking out of the boardroom with her head held high. As she stepped into the hallway, she smiled softly to herself. The weight of years of mockery and being overlooked had lifted, and she knew now that she had not only saved the company, but also reclaimed the respect she had always deserved. No one was laughing anymore, and Joyce knew that from this day forward, they never would. Miss Joyce walked out of the boardroom, her footsteps steady and sure. The same people who once dismissed her now sat in stunned silence, their laughter replaced with respect. She had done more than just fire the CEO. She had taken back her dignity, her power, and her voice. With a quiet smile, she left the building, knowing that from this moment on, no one would ever underestimate her again. The once overlooked security lady had become the hero, and her future was now hers to shape. Don't miss out on more thrilling stories packed with unexpected twists and powerful moments like Miss Joyce's. Subscribe now to stay updated on captivating tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat.